Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a velvet-draped bedroom somewhere in the mid-1800s. The air smells faintly of lavender and dust. A candle flickers on a carved bedside table, casting golden shadows across a lace-covered pillow. You reach beneath it because you've been tossing and turning, and your fingers brush against something odd. Silk, soft, wrapped, tied with the tiniest ribbon. You pull it out. It's hair. A lock of someone's actual hair, perfectly curled, like it was lifted from a porcelain doll, or, a real human. There's no note, just that single ribbon and the silent weight of intent. You blink, then stare, because now you need to know, why is this under your pillow? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're listening. I love seeing where this sleepy weirdness reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1847, and you're sitting on a tufted sofa in a parlor that smells faintly of violets, musty upholstery, and too much sentiment. Across from you, a young woman in dove-gray silk is tucking something into her bodice, something wrapped in paper. She glances up and gives you a sad smile. "It's just Thomas's hair," she says softly. "He wrote poetry and died." You nod, slowly, politely, carefully, not asking whether you're expected to react with tears or tea. Because in the 19th century, it was entirely normal to save someone's hair. A child's curl after their first haircut. A lover's braid before they shipped off to war. A clipping from the dearly departed. People didn't just tuck hair into books. They crafted it into wearable art, wall-hung wreaths, or delicate bouquets framed under glass. It wasn't just a trend. It was a culture. Mainstream historians confirm that Victorian hairwork was considered one of the most sentimental crafts of the era, sometimes categorized under fancy work, alongside embroidery and lace-making. But fringe historians dig deeper. They suggest hair carried power, a form of connection, something spiritual, a relic of the body long after the soul had left the chat. There's debate even now. Was this about grief, love, or vanity? Back in the parlor, the girl shows you her locket. Inside, instead of a miniature painting, there's a tight coil of ash blonde hair, looped in a heart, sealed behind glass. You try not to flinch, because you're still thinking about that curl under your pillow, still wondering whose it was, still questioning what people were trying to hold on to in a world where life was fleeting and death sat comfortably by the hearth. And as you look again at that locket, you realize something unsettling. The hair still shines like it's waiting. You're standing in a dim shop on a rainy street, staring into a jewelry case that glimmers with gold, garnet, and hair. Real hair, not just tucked behind glass this time, but braided, knotted, and spiraled like the filigree of a spider with a flair for drama. The brooches are shaped like teardrops, wreaths, and mourning eyes. One ring, small and delicate, holds a single hair in a crystal tube. Like a relic, the shopkeeper clears her throat and leans in. "That one belonged to a widow," she says. "Wore it every day after the funeral." You nod slowly because you're still processing the idea that in the 1800s people wore jewelry made from the hair of the dead. Not as some morbid curiosity, but as devotion, memory, almost sacred ritual. Outside, the gaslights flicker. Inside, the lockets glint. In Victorian society, mourning had rules. Black veils, black gloves, black everything, but also hair. After a loved one passed, it was customary to cut a lock before burial. That hair, still intact long after decay, was considered eternal, a tether to the person lost. So it was shaped into spirals and wreaths, and mounted into mourning jewelry worn close to the skin. Mainstream historians describe mourning jewelry as a booming industry during the 19th century, especially after the death of Prince Albert, when Queen Victoria herself went full goth in grief for decades. Mourning fashion became the height of style, and hair became its quiet center. But fringe researchers suggest something deeper. Hair was more than memory. It was essence, energy, a piece of someone still alive in its own way. You look down at a necklace looped with hair that coils like ivy. The tag reads, Edmund, 1856 to 1873, favorite cousin. The shopkeeper offers a wan smile. He died falling from a cart. You don't ask how the hair stayed so soft. The arguments among scholars are fascinating. Was this sentimentalism run amok, or an expression of spiritual continuity? Was it coping, control, or just what humans do when they can't bear to let go? You imagine the ring on a finger, the brooch on a collar, the necklace hidden beneath layers of crepe mourning cloth. The hair becomes a secret language, one only the grieving understand. And just when you think you've had enough, the shopkeeper says, "We also offer custom designs." She slides over a booklet. Pages of patterns, rings, pendants, miniatures, all ready to be filled with strands from, well, someone. You close it gently, because you're not sure whether you're more unnerved or impressed. But you walk out of the shop with the scent of old velvet clinging to your sleeves and the memory of Edmund's braided keepsake shimmering behind your eyelids. And as the rain hits your collar, you remember. You're still carrying that curl, still wondering whose it was, still feeling like it's watching. You find yourself seated in a very elegant, but undeniably strange parlor. The wallpaper is floral. The chairs are stiff-backed and embroidered. And in the middle of the room, laid out like a surgeon's tools, is a case filled with very fine tweezers, hooks, needles, tiny combs, and beside them, a palette of human hair in shades of ash, auburn, and deepest black. Would you like a rose or a cross? The hair artist asks without looking up. You blink. Excuse me. She smiles faintly, brushing a lock of your own hair from your coat. For the design, roses are the most popular. Crosses for memorials. Doves if you're feeling sentimental. You were not expecting this. She begins to loop the hair. Someone's hair, not yours, through a thin metal wire, forming delicate shapes that look more like lace than anything that used to grow out of a skull. She's quick, practiced, methodical. In the 19th century, professional hair artists traveled from town to town, offering their services like any other respectable tradesperson. They weren't viewed as odd. They were viewed as skilled, and yes, often booked solid. The Victorians didn't see hair as creepy. They saw it as lasting. In a world where bodies were fragile and disease was never far, hair felt permanent. It didn't decay. It didn't crumble. It stayed. So why not make something beautiful from it? Historians still argue whether these creations were art or obsession. The pieces, some surviving in museums, range from tiny portrait wreaths the size of a pocket watch to full wall-sized spirals of hair woven into blooming family trees. You can barely believe what fingers once built, using just patience, wire, and grief. The hair artist hands you a magnifying glass. Look closely. You do, and it's breathtaking. The piece on the table is a perfect daisy. Its petals are made of hair, light brown, tied with thread so fine it's nearly invisible. The center of the flower? A knot of darker curls, looped into a perfect circle. It's for a daughter, the artist says. She passed in the spring. You don't know what to say. You just nod, because there's something reverent about it, quiet, and shockingly human. Then the artist pulls out her notebook. You'll need to write their name, she says, so I can include it in the pattern. You pause. The lock in your pocket, still tied with ribbon, feels heavier now. You haven't said whose it is, because you're not entirely sure you know, but somehow you start writing anyway. The artist doesn't ask questions. She just takes the name, the hair, and begins weaving memory into something permanent. And as her fingers work, swift and soft, you start to feel that strange calm again, that hum beneath the silence, that ancient instinct that says, hold on. You're seated in a candlelit bedroom with far too much lace. The mirror is draped in black. A corset hangs on the back of a chair like it gave up halfway through mourning. And there, on the vanity, is a letter folded into thirds, sealed with wax and tied, of course, with a strand of hair that you've wandered into a love story. But not the kind with grand declarations and violins. No, this is quieter, stranger, intimately sentimental in a way that feels both romantic and mildly unsettling. Victorian couples didn't just exchange rings or handwritten notes. They exchanged hair, braided into watch chains, sewn into handkerchief hems, tucked into lockets worn close to the heart. literal fragments of the beloved carried everywhere, like portable presents. You gently open the letter. Inside, pressed flat and looped into a bow, is a fine lock of chestnut brown hair. A line below it reads, "For when you miss me more than I am worth." You smile. That's either heartbreakingly sweet or an early form of emotional blackmail. Historians confirm that hair tokens were among the most popular forms of keepsake exchanged between lovers in the 19th century. They were tangible, personal, and unlike photos or pressed flowers, they didn't fade. The most treasured keepsakes weren't diamonds. They were bits of you. Romantic? Certainly. Creepy? Slightly. Fringe researchers argue that exchanging hair wasn't just a fad. It was a ritual. Pact. Especially for women, giving a lock of hair was layered with meaning. Could symbolize affection, commitment, even premarital intimacy. Though nobody said it out loud. Giving hair was giving trust. Accepting it? That meant responsibility. You glance at the letter again. The handwriting is delicate. The words slightly smudged. You imagine a young man, packing for a train ride or sea voyage, slipping this letter into his coat pocket, not knowing when or if he'd return. Now the hair is all that remains. You run your finger along the braided strand. It's soft, remarkably so, and suddenly you understand the appeal. It's as if a part of someone is still there, still touchable, still real. In the drawer beneath the vanity, you find a silk pouch. Inside, dozens of ribbons, each bound around a different lock of hair. Some labeled, some not. One simply says, "When we were young." There's something reverent about how they're kept. You feel like an intruder, rifling through decades of whispered promises and stitched together longing. And then, tucked in the corner, you find a man's pocket watch. You pop it open, there's no clock face. Just a miniature braid of gold and black hair, coiled like a serpent, resting beneath a piece of glass. You close it gently, because suddenly, this isn't about time at all, that it's about what people feared losing, and how they tried, so desperately, to keep it close. You're in a darkened parlor now, draped entirely in mourning black. Even the wallpaper seems to sigh. The clock ticks softly in the corner, muffled by heavy velvet, and in the center of the room lies a coffin. Not morbid, not gory, just inevitable. Surrounded by lilies, shadow, and silence, the woman kneels beside it with silver shears in her hand. She leans forward, parts a strand of the deceased's hair, and snips, carefully, reverently. She ties it with a thin black ribbon and places it in a small envelope. Then she does it again, for the sister, for the aunt, for the man from the church who cried during the hymn. Everyone gets a piece. You're not dreaming. You're watching a tradition unfold. In the 19th century, it was common, expected even, to clip the hair of a loved one before burial. Especially for women and children, whose hair symbolized youth, vitality, and memory. The hair was saved, gifted, and sometimes even displayed during the wake, pressed between glass or braided into mourning jewelry. It sounds macabre now. But then, it was love, loss made visible. Mainstream historians note that funeral customs of the Victorian era were highly codified. Mourning wasn't just an emotion, it was a schedule, a wardrobe, a performance. And hair? Hair was proof, a way to say, I knew them, I remember. Fringe theorists take it further. They argue that cutting hair preserved not just memory, but presence. That hair held some essence, a trace of soul, something the grave couldn't swallow. You wander toward a side table. On it lies a small black velvet box. You open it. Inside is a brooch, a dark garnet rim, delicate gold clasp, and in the center, woven hair, looped into the shape of an open eye. It stares upward, watchful, eternal. You feel goosebumps rise. The grieving family gathers. Each guest is given a sprig of rosemary and a tiny packet, sealed in wax. Inside, a lock of the departed's hair. Yours is soft, auburn, and still warm from the room. They tell you to place it in your coat pocket, near the heart. You do, because everyone else does. And somehow it feels right. A little strange, yes, but intimate, grounded, more lasting than flowers. You sit beside the fire later that evening, packet still tucked away. The flames flicker, the morning garments rustle. Someone hums a hymn so low, it feels like breath, and the lock of hair presses gently against your chest. Quiet proof that someone was here, that they mattered, that they're not entirely gone. Not while this little piece remains. You're thumbing through a book, thick, hand-bound, and covered in dusty velvet. The pages are yellowed with time and perfume stained, each one labeled in careful script. It's not a diary, not exactly a photo album either. It's something stranger. You've opened a family's album of affections. Each page contains a lock of hair, affixed with a dab of glue or a single silk stitch. Underneath, there's usually a name, a date, and sometimes a note. Sarah, age 2, first haircut. Elijah, 1874, before the storm. Some are pressed into decorative shapes, braids, rings, hearts. Others are just tufts, unstyled but sacred. You flip another page, and another dot. A dozen people, a dozen lives, held in place by tiny strands. In the 19th century, these books were fairly common in some circles, particularly among women in upper-middle-class homes. Scrapbooking wasn't just for dried flowers or calling cards. It was for people, too. Not in words, not in paintings, but in hair. You reach a page labeled Father, Last Winter. The lock is gray and brittle, looped into a horseshoe. You pause. Historians note that albums like these were more than memory keepers. They were family trees in miniature, touchable ancestry. You didn't need a portrait when you could hold a real strand. DNA before anyone knew what DNA was. But others argue this practice blurred the line between sentiment and obsession. One particularly dramatic scholar once called them museums of personal ghosthood, which sounds poetic until you realize you're halfway through a book that's essentially part organic. Some pages are messy, curls flattened awkwardly, the glue having browned like old fruit. Others are pristine, looped with metallic thread and labeled with calligraphy. There's one from a pet, labeled Lady Bumbles, Faithful Spaniel. You can't decide if you're charmed or unsettled. And there, near the back, is a page with no name, just a golden curl, carefully folded, and the words, "She never came home." You sit back. It's not just a record. It's grief pressed into parchment. As you gently close the book, you notice a pouch tucked into the back cover. Inside, a tiny woven bracelet made of interlaced hair in 2 colors, one dark, one pale, bound together by thread. A note reads, "Together, always." You don't know their names. You don't know their story. But you know they mattered to someone. And tonight, by candlelight and quiet, you've met them. You're standing in a long, echoing gallery. Gilt-framed portraits of stern royals peer down at you from velvet-lined walls. Marble busts line the corridor like they're judging your shoes. And at the far end, beneath glass and gold, is a tiny brooch, no larger than a coin. Inside the brooch, a curl of chestnut hair. You've arrived at the royal obsession stage of the story. Queen Victoria, bless her black silk soul, didn't just popularize mourning dress. She made it fashionable to grieve, in public, at scale, and forever. And when her beloved Prince Albert died in 1861, she turned personal loss into national identity. For the next 40 years, she wore black. She avoided public events, and she kept locks of Albert's hair everywhere, woven into jewelry, tucked into books, even displayed in glass domes. You peek into a vitrine. Inside, a bracelet made of Albert's hair, braided so tightly it looks like wire. A miniature portrait hangs beside it, Victoria in widow's lace, her gaze defiant and impossibly sad. Historians agree that Victoria's devotion to her husband transformed grief culture in Britain and beyond. Her mourning set the tone for the 19th century, influencing everything from etiquette books to accessory trends. But some scholars note that hair had been exchanged between lovers and family long before her reign. She didn't invent the custom, she amplified it. Fringe theorists go even further. They say she ritualized loss, that she turned hair into sacrament, that her endless mourning allowed ordinary people to grieve more openly, more permanently. You move past a set of handwritten letters, sealed with locks of hair in tiny envelopes. Some were gifts from royal subjects. "Here is my son's hair," one note reads. "He died in India. I thought Her Majesty might understand." You blink. Because yes, apparently Victoria didn't just collect Albert's hair. She accepted it from others, too. Gifts from grieving citizens who saw their own sorrow reflected in hers. There's a rumor she kept a room in each of her homes for his memory, filled with his belongings, his clothing, and yes, his hair. You step out of the gallery and into cool evening air. The sky is heavy with clouds. A woman nearby tightens her shawl. "Romantic, isn't it?" she says, nodding back toward the display. You don't answer right away, because romantic feels too light, too modern, too Instagrammed. You think instead of Victoria, alone in her palace holding a locket. Inside, a curl, all that was left of a life. And somehow it was enough. You're standing in the middle of a parlor that looks more like a museum than a living room. Everything is neatly dusted, nothing is out of place. And above the fireplace hangs a wreath. But not a wreath made of flowers, it's made of hair. You lean in, instinctively, to understand. The delicate braids curve like vines. Tiny loops and curls spiral outward in perfect symmetry. Each petal, tendril, and twist composed entirely of human strands. At the bottom, a label. The Williams family, 1832 to 1879. You step back slowly. Because yes, someone made this. Someone clipped, sorted, braided, and wired the hair of a dozen relatives into a single decorative piece, and then hung it above the mantel like it was the good china. This wasn't rare. In fact, during the height of the Victorian era, hair wreaths were a popular parlor centerpiece. Some were purely memorial, made after funerals, honoring those who'd passed. Others were living family trees, added to over time as marriages happened, children arrived, elders aged and faded. It was ancestry in 3 dimensions. And people were proud of it. Mainstream historians place these wreaths within the broader context of parlor culture. The Victorian idea that your home should reflect your morality, intellect, and family devotion. A hair wreath wasn't just decoration. It was statement, testament, legacy. Fringe scholars note the quiet weirdness of it. Art made from bodies, not about bodies. An entire aesthetic built around domestic deathcraft. And yet, here it is, looped and lacquered and mounted where the fire crackles. You notice a framed photo on the side table. A woman sits beside the wreath, hands folded, a faint smile that says, "Yes, I made this. It took weeks, sometimes months, to finish a piece like this." The work was detailed and deeply personal. Hair was sorted by color, then braided into family units. Dark for the father's side, blonde for the cousins, gray for grandmother, woven delicately at the wreath's center. You reach out, just barely, to trace a loop of auburn. It feels oddly warm, soft, as if the memory hasn't cooled yet. A child enters the room and points up. "That's me," she says proudly, touching her curls. You smile, because suddenly it doesn't seem morbid at all. It's not about holding on to the dead. It's about remembering the living, about marking time, family, connection, in a world that changed too fast and ended too soon. Above the mantel, the wreath glows in firelight, quiet, beautiful, a loop that never breaks. You're seated at a low desk with yellowing pages spread before you. Beside your hand, a pair of polished scissors, a loop of thread, and a spool of, yes, human hair. Across from you, a woman in a stiff bodice adjusts her spectacles and opens a worn cloth-bound book titled, "The Art of Hairwork." "This chapter," she says, tapping the page, "is on double basket plaiting, ideal for bracelets." You nod like that makes sense. Because tonight, you've stepped into the world of hairwork instruction manuals, the surprisingly popular 19th century DIY guides that taught people how to make friendship rings, picture frames, and yes, entire bouquets out of real hair. And the instructions? They're precise, methodical, enthusiastic. Point 1 passage reads, "To form the lily of the valley, create 2 loops of number 8 jet black hair, twisted counterwise and affixed to a number 3 French wire." You imagine the readers, Widows, daughters, lovers, all hunched over lamplight, braiding grief into geometry. Mainstream historians agree that by the mid-1800s, hairwork wasn't just a mourning custom, it was a domestic art. Women were encouraged to learn it the same way they learned embroidery or piano. Entire books were published to meet demand, many with hand-drawn diagrams and surprisingly upbeat tone. But fringe scholars suggest the manuals weren't just craftsmen's guides, they were emotional handbooks, outlets. In a society that discouraged open displays of emotion, looping a lock of your dead husband's hair into a floral rosette was a socially acceptable way to scream into the void. You glance back at the page. There's a full diagram of a mourning brooch bouquet, each petal made from a different person. The caption reads, "To be worn during the second mourning year." Second, as in, there's a first. You hold the hair carefully and follow the instructions. Loop, twist, pin, tie. After a while, your fingers take over. You stop reading. You just braid. One loop after another. It becomes meditative, rhythmic, like prayer with scissors. The woman across from you smiles. You're a natural. You glance down. You've made a tiny heart, delicate and tight. "Save it," she says. "Add a name when you're ready." You nod. But you don't add one just yet. Because part of you isn't sure whose name it will be. And part of you already knows. You're walking down a narrow, gaslit street in 1870s London? Or is it Boston? Paris? The fog and cobblestones don't care. What matters is the row of little shops, their windows glowing like lanterns in the mist, and the delicate handwriting painted across the glass. Mourning hairwork and memorial curios. You pause. One window shows a necklace looped into a perfect teardrop, made entirely from golden strands. Another displays framed wreaths, intricate and floral, with brass nameplates etched in copperplate script. And in one corner, a dainty brooch labeled simply, "Mother." You step inside. The bell above the door chimes softly. A woman in widow's black rises from behind a counter. "For a loved one?" she asks, already reaching for her catalog. You nod, though you're not sure if that's the right answer. This is the 19th century mourning market, where hair wasn't just memory, it was merchandise. Not mass-produced, but meticulously handcrafted and deeply personal, offered to grieving families, love-struck sweethearts, or anyone with a lock of hair and a longing to keep something, anything, close. Historians note that by the 1850s, hairwork had become a thriving cottage industry. There were independent artisans, established shops, even department store counters dedicated to hair-based memorials. You could send in a curl and get back a custom-made necklace, framed art, or a pocket watch chain woven with astonishing skill. But some fringe researchers whisper of stranger transactions, vendors selling anonymous locks, pre-braided and prettily packaged, to those too afraid or ashamed to ask for hair in person. Love tokens from no one in particular. Memory as retail therapy. The shopkeeper opens a drawer filled with padded envelopes, each one labeled, "Child, light brown," "Gentleman, silvered at temples," unlabeled, "Auburn, discounted." You blink. The idea that someone might buy a stranger's hair to pretend, or to simply feel, strikes you as both sad and strangely human. She sets a glass dome on the counter. Inside, a miniature bouquet, roses, forget-me-nots, and lilies, all made of hair. The tag reads, "Commissioned for Mrs. Everly, 1863. 2 sons, 1 husband, 1 sister." You feel a strange ache in your chest, because what is grief, if not trying to build beauty from what's left? You leave the shop carrying a velvet box. Inside, a simple ring of dark hair twisted into a circle. No label, no date. You don't know whose it is, but for some reason that makes it easier to hold. You're in the back room of an old gentleman's library, a quiet corner where the shelves creak and the oil lamps smell faintly of burnt pepper. On the table before you, a tray of samples. Hair samples. Not for jewelry, not for love, but for science? Or at least the version of science that 19th century enthusiasts firmly believed in. When skull bumps predicted morality, seances were weekend hobbies, and a single strand of hair was considered a gateway to the soul, the spirit, or the criminal mind. A man in pince-nez glasses and a saffron waistcoat is carefully measuring 2 strands of hair against a ruler. This one, he says with gravitas, belonged to a spiritual medium. He picks up another. And this was found at the site of a murder. You adjust your seat. Because tonight you've wandered into the strange crossroads where hair met pseudoscience. Victorians didn't just clip and keep hair. They analyzed it, catalogued it, whispered theories over it. Some believed the hair of clairvoyance held residual energy, that it could be used in seances, or even made to twitch if the spirit world was active nearby. Others thought hair revealed character. Softness meant gentleness. A wiry strand hinted at deception. There were even cases where lovers exchanged hair, not for keepsakes, but to have it read. Historians still argue whether these practices were rooted in curiosity, spiritualism, or desperation. But it's documented. Hair was used in seances, in early forensics, and in phrenology-adjacent studies meant to determine class, temperament, or trustworthiness. You lift a jar marked Sarah, age 19, suspected of theft. Inside, nothing more than a fine blonde curl, perfectly preserved. The man leans close. They say hair retains energy, he whispers. If a crime is unresolved, the strand hums. You smile awkwardly. Surely that's nonsense. Right? He opens a thick leather-bound ledger. Page after page of names, crimes, reputations, each paired with a sample, snipped and sorted. It's like a ghostly index. Memory rendered biological. He points to a sealed envelope. Correspondence from Boston. Medium's hair enclosed. Do not open after dark. You absolutely want to open it. But you don't. Instead, you sit back and let the strange reverence settle around you. Because in this room, hair isn't just a token. It's evidence, witness, possibility. And as the lamp flickers, you can't help but wonder. What would your own strands say about you? You're sitting at a small writing desk, candlelight dancing across crisp parchment. There's a hairpin beside the ink pot, a little envelope, and a quiet sort of daring in the air, like someone is about to do something slightly unhinged and very heartfelt. Because you're not writing a letter. You're sending your hair through the mail. It's the 1870s. The postal service is booming. Trains are swift, stamps are cheap, and suddenly, everyone is swapping locks of hair with long-distance lovers, pen pals, grieving friends, and sometimes complete strangers. Yes, strangers. You finish tying a pale ribbon around a neatly coiled lock. The letter beside it reads, "For you, so you might remember the sound of my laugh." You fold the note, seal it with wax, and tuck it all into a padded envelope labeled fragile, personal. Historians confirm the popularity of this practice. Hair in letters was almost cliché by the mid-19th century. Etiquette books included instructions. Magazines printed DIY envelope linings to keep strands from tangling en route. Some postal clerks allegedly handled such letters with extra care because, well, nobody wants to be the guy who crushed grandma's memorial braid. But fringe researchers dig deeper. They note that many hair swaps happened between people who had never met. Young women sent locks to soldiers. Spiritualists sent them to mediums. Some even advertised in newspapers. Will exchange a token of affection, brown, curled, with gentlemen of refined taste. You glance at your inbox. It's a stack of letters. Inside each hair. Some dyed. Some perfumed. Some labeled with tiny poems. One envelope simply says, "If you're lonely, here I am." There's something deeply human about it. A piece of the self sent through time and space. No screen. No photograph. Just the real you. Fragile. Tangible. Offered. You open one letter. A lock of raven-black hair spills onto your desk. The note is short. "I felt you'd understand me without words." You stare at it longer than you mean to. Maybe this wasn't just about keepsakes. Maybe it was communication at its most intimate. Bypassing logic, skipping small talk, and saying, "Here I am. Touch this. I'm real." You lean back. The candle flickers low. And suddenly, your own envelope, your own little offering, doesn't feel so strange at all. You're seated in a candlelit study where the curtains are drawn, not against light, but against judgment. Before you is a small chest of keepsakes. Old letters tied in string, dried violets, and, of course, a sachet filled with human hair. Blonde. Fine. Carefully folded into a silk pocket that smells faintly of rosewater and dust. The room is quiet. Too quiet. Because tonight's question isn't what they kept, it's WHY in the 19th century. Collecting hair straddled a fine line between deep sentiment and something more superstitious. To many, it was innocent affection. To others, it bordered on magical thinking. Keeping a part of someone, especially after they died, was more than remembrance. It was preservation, protection, power. You unfold a scrap of paper tucked beside the sachet. Written in delicate script, for safety in sleep, keep near the heart. You pause. Sleep protection, heart proximity. This isn't just a love token. This is talismanic. Historians note that while most hairkeeping was rooted in memorial or romantic culture, threads of superstition ran deep beneath the surface. Some believed hair carried a person's essence. Holding it meant holding them. Others warned never to burn hair, lest you curse the soul it came from. Still others buried their own hair to prevent sickness from returning. You lift another sachet. Inside 3 hairs, coiled together, with a pressed clover and a sliver of bone. A chill flickers up your spine. Fringe researchers argue that much of this wasn't consciously magical. It was emotional. When grief meets ritual, even the mundane can take on meaning. A lock of hair becomes a ward, a charm, a way to say, "Don't leave me, not entirely." But not everyone agreed. Some religious leaders warned against the custom. Some physicians mocked it. And some families quietly removed such items from the home once mourning passed. Afraid that lingering hair might tether too tightly, you run your fingers along the rim of the chest. You feel the weight of love, of fear, of people trying to trap time inside ribbons. And you wonder, if it were your loved one, would you keep the lock? Even now? Probably, because logic rarely wins in the face of loss. And deep down, part of you would want that strand. To hold, to hide, to hope. You're in a candlelit parlor, but it's not somber this time. It's buzzing. Not with electricity, but with low conversation, polite laughter, and the sound of tiny scissors snipping near a sideboard. Tea clinks in china. A woman in a violet dress passes by with a tray of currant cakes. This, you realize, is not a funeral. It's a meeting of the Hair Collectors Society. It's not satire. It's not secret. It's sincere. Here, in this quiet social gathering, men and women have come together to display, discuss, and swap their most prized locks of human hair, each labeled, catalogued, and preserved with startling care. You wander past a table where a gentleman in a brocade waistcoat is proudly unfolding a velvet panel covered in tiny loops. "Dukes, mostly," he murmurs, "and one poet." At another table, a young woman unveils a tiny glass jar. Inside, a curl so fine and pale it looks like spun moonlight. "My cousin's baby," she says softly. "She only lived 20 days. You nod, because what else do you do when someone shows you grief in such a small, perfect spiral? Mainstream historians acknowledge that gatherings like this existed, not always formal societies, but salons, craft circles, even traveling exhibitions. Hair was discussed like art, traded like baseball cards, and collected with the intensity of stamp collectors, especially when it came from someone famous. But fringe scholars hint at something more sacred, that these meetings were less about aesthetics and more about longing, about holding on to presence in a world that could snatch people away with fever, war, or accident. In a century obsessed with cataloging, hair offered a form of personal taxonomy, proof that someone lived, mattered, was touched. You settle beside an older woman stitching a hair rosette into linen. "Would you like to try?" she asks, offering you a needle already threaded with someone else's memory. You hesitate, then nod. She guides your hand. Loop, twist, anchor. You're contributing now to a community that knows the unspoken weight of remembrance. A bell chimes from the mantel. Tea is refreshed. A new guest arrives and unwraps a brooch from tissue paper. It contains a lock labeled 4JH 1859. Still missed. Someone sighs. Someone smiles. And for a room full of loss, it somehow feels alive. You're in a quiet study lined with dusty books and velvet drapes, the kind of place where the curtains are always drawn. Whether for privacy or protection, you're not sure. A lamp flickers low, and in front of you sits a glass case. Inside it, a perfectly preserved curl of dark hair. Next to it, a tag. Napoleon Bonaparte, snipped posthumously, 1821. You step back. Because suddenly, this isn't just about memory or mourning. This is about fame. Yes, we've reached the part of the story where hair collecting becomes less about affection and more about obsession. Not all hair was given. Some was taken. Some was stolen. And some was cut from the heads of corpses that definitely didn't give permission. Throughout the 19th century, locks of hair became status objects. Having a piece of someone important, an author, a general, a queen, was like having a relic. And people went to surprising lengths to get it. A few hairs from a deathbed could fetch a hefty price. Dealers popped up who specialized in celebrity strands. Some locks came with letters of authenticity. Others were sold with suspiciously vague stories and very confident signatures. Historians confirm that famous hair collecting was real and widespread. Thomas Jefferson's hair? In museums. Beethoven? Hair. Poe? Definitely hair. Even Abraham Lincoln's, snipped during his autopsy and later displayed at the Chicago Historical Society. But fringe researchers dig into the darker side. Hair theft. There were rumors, some true, of undertakers sneaking clippings before the casket closed, of housemaids pilfering combs, of fans bribing gravediggers. In some cases, hair was stolen not just for keepsakes but for profit. You're shown a locket by the collector hosting you tonight. Inside, a fine golden strand. Lord Byron, he says with a grin. Allegedly. You raise an eyebrow. Allegedly? Well, he concedes. It could be his dog. But either way, it's authentic to someone. You don't know whether to laugh or cry. Because that's what this whole strange world is. The blurry space between sentiment and sensationalism. You examine the hair again. It's impossibly fine, faintly curled. A note is tucked behind it. Taken by candlelight, beneath the veil. You set it down gently. Some historians say this obsession with famous hair was a way for ordinary people to feel close to greatness. Others argue it was an early form of celebrity culture, just less Instagram, more embalming fluid. But you can't help wondering about the ethics of it all. Did they ask? And even if they didn't, does that make it any less meaningful to the person holding it? Because in the end, someone cared enough to keep it safe, to display it, to say, this mattered. And maybe in a world that loses so much so fast, that's enough. You're in a gentleman's study. Not just any study, the kind with green leather chairs, a decanter of brandy no one touches until after dusk, and a grandfather clock that ticks just a little too loud. The desk is massive. The mood? Mournful. You open a drawer. Inside, a box. Cedarwood. Polished. And within it, nestled like treasure, are envelopes. Dozens of them. Each labeled with neat handwriting. And each contains hair. Welcome to the rarely discussed but entirely real world of men who kept locks. Poets, soldiers, statesmen, explorers, all quietly holding on to something soft in a world that expected them to be hard. One envelope is labeled "Me" before the crossing. Another, Mother's Braid, 1844. And another, simply, Still Hurts. Historians often focus on women in the hairkeeping tradition. Fair, since they crafted it into art and wore it with outward sentimentality. But men collected too. Quietly, privately. They kept hair as tokens of love, grief, loyalty. They carried locks into war, tucked them in breast pockets, hid them behind portraits. Not for display, for endurance. You pick up a journal lying open on the desk. It belongs to a soldier. The page reads, I wore her hair tied round my wrist. I felt brave. Fringe researchers point out that male hairkeeping may have been more widespread than the records show. It simply wasn't spoken of. In a society that measured manhood in stoicism and silence, sentiment was secret. Hair allowed emotion without admission. You flip through letters written from trenches, ships, faraway colonies. Again and again. Tell her I still have her ribbon. I pray over her lock each night. Some even carried their own hair in lockets, to be sent home if they didn't return. A preemptive keepsake. Grief in advance, you find one such piece. A braid, tucked inside a silver locket. A note beside it reads, "If I am lost, return this to Clara." You sit with that for a while. Because there's a quiet power in someone preparing to be mourned. And in hair, stubborn, soft, enduring. They found something that could cross time, oceans, and war. You glance at the final envelope in the box, it's unopened. No name, no date, just one word, always. You don't open it, you just hold it, breathing in cedar and memory. You're standing in the center of a warm, well-lit Victorian drawing room, where the furniture is embroidered and the wallpaper aggressively floral. It's the kind of space where nothing's out of place, except, perhaps, for the large rectangular frame hanging above the settee. You tilt your head, because at first glance it looks like a bouquet, or a sketch, but as you step closer, you realize it's hair, woven into wreaths, branches, and flowers. Entire arrangements of looping tendrils and sculpted curls, all made from the strands of actual people, real, remembered, and now somehow part of the decor. Yes, this is hair art, but not tucked away in a locket or sealed in a keepsake drawer. This is public, displayed. Proud.in the 19th century, hairwork wasn't just about mourning or romance. It was also a craft, a legitimate, time-consuming, hyper-detailed form of art. And for many households, framed hairpieces were a symbol of refinement, taste, and deep family roots. Historians note that these creations often began as small keepsakes and slowly grew into larger compositions. Family trees, floral scenes, sometimes even full landscapes. You could walk into a parlor and see an entire generation hanging on the wall, quite literally. Fringe researchers suggest something else, that these pieces weren't just family portraits. They were domestic shrines, everyday altars to continuity, connection, and care. They weren't just art. They were sacred objects. You lean in. One petal is made from golden hair. The stem, darker. The flower's center, a tight coil of silver gray. Each strand labeled on the back, if you dare to peek. Eliza, 1848. Mother, 1861. T. Lost at sea. You run a finger gently along the frame. This isn't about death. Not entirely. It's about presence. About saying these people lived here. They mattered. And now, they bloom on a side table. You notice a catalog, The Art of Hair Embellishment for the Home, published 1872. The pages are filled with pattern suggestions. Ivy for longevity. Lilies for virtue. Willow branches for mourning. You flip to a page titled, How to Prepare a Parlor Wreath. The supplies list, wire, thread, patience, love. You glance at the framed wreath again. It's delicate, quiet, almost breathing. Someone once stood where you are now, admiring it. Maybe they made it. Maybe they cried while doing so. And now it's here, still intact, still shining, still whispering. You're standing at a threshold, not of a room, but of an era. The wallpaper is newer now, less floral, more geometric. The light bulbs hum instead of candles flickering. And the hair? The hair is gone. Well, almost. You're in a 20th century home, maybe 1920 or 1935. There's a bookshelf, a piano, a family photo or two. But no framed hair wreath. No velvet-lined brooch boxes. No labeled strands in delicate drawers. What once was art, ritual, and love has become, well, uncomfortable. You notice a shoebox tucked at the back of a high shelf. Inside, old things, postcard, a dried flower, a lock of hair wrapped in yellowed paper. No note, no name. Someone kept it, but they didn't display it. Because by now, the custom of collecting human hair has fallen out of fashion. The Victorian hairwork craze, once mainstream and respected, is being viewed through new eyes, and those eyes are suspicious. Historians point to multiple causes for the decline. Modernity, science, changing aesthetics. Mass photography offered another way to remember people. Grief became more private. Sanitation, psychology, and a new sense of what's tasteful edged out traditions that once held deep meaning. Fringe scholars note that this shift wasn't just practical. It was cultural. The 20th century grew uneasy with the body, especially the dead one. Hair, once sacred, started to feel icky. And with the rise of Freud, sentiment itself became suspect. Holding on too long? Clearly unhealthy. You find a 1913 etiquette guide. It warns against morbidity in mourning, advising widows to avoid dwelling overmuch upon the corporeal. Translation: stop saving the hair. Still, people did. Quietly, shamefully, in attics, under beds, at the back of sewing drawers. They just didn't talk about it anymore. You walk through a modest parlor. A woman, maybe a granddaughter, unwraps a strange old brooch she found in a trunk. She turns it over, sees the hair, frowns, then gently places it back. Because she doesn't understand. Not really. But she knows it once meant something. And for now, that's enough. You're scrolling online, yes, now we're here, and your screen is filled with photos. Not memes, not influencers, but hair. Braided, stitched, sculpted, woven. Some in glass lockets, others in delicate wall hangings. One, unmistakably, in the shape of a heart pierced by a thread-wrapped pin. You blink. Because modern hair art isn't gone, it's just moved. You're exploring Etsy now. Or Instagram. Or some dimly lit art gallery where everything smells faintly of clove oil and ambition. And there, among the paintings and installations, are works crafted entirely from human hair. Gathered ethically, sometimes anonymously, sometimes by commission. Each one echoing the past, but with its own modern twist. One piece is a full wreath. Blonde, pink, jet black. The caption reads, "A family fractured." Another is a brooch carved from resin, encasing a strand of hair and a line of poetry. You left me your silence. You find a creator explaining her process. "I only use donated hair," she says softly. "It carries energy. I just shape the memory." Historians cautiously recognize this revival. While hair art is no longer mainstream, it's found a strange, tender corner in the world of folk craft, feminist reclamation, and conceptual art. For some, it's a nod to ancestors. For others, it's commentary on the body, identity, or permanence. Fringe theorists love it, of course. They see the loop closing. That even in a world of pixels and filters, we're still reaching back for something tangible, something from the body. Something that says, "I was here. I mattered." You click on a video. A young artist threads hair into a tiny spiral, then sets it in wax. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Because even now, the language of hair whispers across time. You look at your own reflection. You think about who's touched your hair, who's brushed it back, who's pulled it, braided it, buried their face in it. What would it mean to keep a single strand? Not for fashion, not for art, but for love. Maybe the Victorians weren't so strange after all. You're seated in a small, sunlit room. The window is open. A breeze stirs the curtains and carries the scent of something warm. Maybe lavender, maybe old paper. Before you lies a single strand of hair. It's not dramatic, not styled, just there. You turn it in your fingers and it catches the light, almost glows. Because tonight, after all the wreaths and rings and velvet-lined keepsake boxes, the question comes quietly. Why? Why did they keep it? Why did they braid it, frame it, mail it across oceans? Why do we still, even now, understand, deep in our chests, that a lock of someone's hair means something? Historians offer explanations. Ritual, grief, memory, intimacy. Hair is durable, personal. It holds DNA, scent, a moment frozen in time. But none of those facts explain the feeling you get when you hold it. The strange ache, the stillness, the echo. Fringe scholars call it ancestral tethering, our attempt to stay connected even as life pulls us apart. A talisman against forgetting, a protest against the clock. You open a drawer nearby. Inside, there's a hair ribbon tied in a bow, soft with age. No label, no context. And yet, you know it was loved. That's the thing. You don't need to know whose hair it was to understand why it was saved. Because you've lost people too. Or will. And when you do, you'll search for things to keep. A scent. A photo. A voicemail. Or yes, maybe even a strand of hair. You lift it carefully. It's fragile. And also completely unchanged. Because no matter how many years pass, hair does what memory can't always do. It endures. And as you sit in the soft hush of the room, holding that strand between your fingers, you feel what they must have felt. Not just sorrow, but closeness. A whisper that says, still here. So now, you sit very still. The room is quiet, the light soft and gold at the edges. That little strand of hair rests where your fingers left it, curled gently, like it's exhaling. Everything slows. You let your breath match the pace of the story you've just walked through. A story not about famous wars or crowns, but about people trying to hold on. About love and loss and the simplest thing we could keep of someone. A thread from their body, a trace of their presence, a reminder that they were here. It's strange, isn't it? How something so small could carry so much. But then again, maybe it's not strange at all, because you've kept things too. A shirt you never wear, a voice recording you can't delete, a birthday card with handwriting you still trace with your thumb. We all keep pieces of people. The Victorians just did it with a bit more flair. And ribbon. You glance one more time at the invisible curl in the air. You imagine the fingers that clipped it, the hearts it passed through, the drawer where it slept for 100 years. Then you let the image fade. Let it drift. Like everything we love eventually must. Your breath softens, your hands go still, and the story, now fully told, leans into silence. Thanks for spending tonight with me.